Good morning and welcome to the Nelson Mandela University Business School's Recovery to Growth webinar series. I am Professor Ronin Mwati. I'm the Director of the School of Economics, Development and Tourism at Nelson Mandela University. This webinar is part of the Business Recovery to Growth webinar series that's held from June to October 2021. The 2021 Business Recovery to Growth webinar series aims to bring together expertise on growth and development. We acknowledge the role of localization as an enabler for economic growth. There are some pertinent questions that we ask ourselves, and that is, amongst others, has globalization reached its peak? And how did COVID-19 expose a fractured system? We ask ourselves, is localization a panacea for our struggling economy? And will the community benefit? More importantly, do we have the appropriate skills and capabilities to bring about opportunity and prosperity for all? As economists, we all know that economic development refers mainly to equitable distribution of growth. Given the structure of the economy in South Africa, which is based on inequality, are we ever going to achieve this equitable distribution of growth? We then emphasize economic growth in many of our policies, and we say this growth must lead to job creation. But what about jobless growth due to mechanization of the economy and capital intensity in our methods of production, which is forced upon us by imperatives of globalization? Our interest rates are relatively low in line with other countries of the world. This is due to attempts to stimulate the economy in order to create jobs. However, what we find that we are faced with high unemployment rate in South Africa, reaching a high of 32.5%. Our fiscal policy, on the other hand, is also accommodative, but none of this leads to job creation in South Africa. Given this background, today we welcome our keynote speaker, Ms. Nikki Weimer, Chief Economist, Nedbank, who will address us on the topic, how can SA business attain growth levels that support economic development? As we enter this discussion, I would just like to mention that if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in your Zoom control panel. We'll have time for questions at the end of our speaker's input. Let me now introduce to you Nikki Weimer. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce to you Nikki Weimer, who is a Nedbank Chief Economist. She has been the senior economist since 2000. She received a master's in economics from the University of Stellenbosch in 1994 and soon advised government on economic procedures and policies in her capacity as an economist in the Central Economic Advisory Service, which has since been integrated into the President's office. Her experience in the banking, securities, and brokering industries has given a broader knowledge of a wide range of fields within economics, including sector analysis, fixed investment trends, as well as the relationship between real economic trends and developments within the financial markets. At Nedbank, Nikki focuses on trends in the overall economy, looking at cycles in economic growth, inflation, and interest rates. She regularly does talks all over the country to all sorts of audiences, including business forums, property groups, large corporate firms, and government entities. Now it's my pleasure to hand to you Nikki Weimer, who will take the webinar on this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Yes, hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you today. My job today is to really talk about how can South Africa achieve faster and more sustainable growth. And clearly, that is the challenge we face. It's a complex subject. It's certainly not something that we are going to resolve in the half an hour I have here with you today. So I've decided that let's rather focus it on some of the key things that might be doable within our immediate time horizon. So before we get into that nitty-gritty and before we deal with that, I thought it's best that we all get onto the same page. We have a quick look at where South Africa stands now. How's our economy performed? What's, you know, what is our situation as we speak now? Now, the good news is that South Africa has started to climb out of the lockdown hole. And it has been an incredibly deep pit. What I show you here is South Africa's economic performance. It's our gross domestic product, which is, of course, the value of all goods and services produced within the borders of South Africa. And the line there, the green line there, that's the rand value of goods and services produced. That's the rand value of GDP. And the bars are really your growth rate. And we're looking at the year-on-year growth rate here. And you can see what strict lockdown did to South Africa. So this has been the consequence of the pandemic. GDP literally collapsed as government imposed level 5 lockdown. And from the moment they lifted level 5, which lasted mainly during April last year, the economy started to recover. So the moment they allowed more economic activity to take place and more industries to operate in a normal fashion, you saw that the economy immediately kind of started to bounce back. So lockdown was a very artificial disruption to economic activity. And we have seen that this recovery has started. Our GDP growth really went from the disastrous overnight minus 17% in the second quarter of last year. And slowly we started to crawl our way back. And so the rate of decline moderated from over 17% to 3.2% in the first quarter of this year. So that's the good news. A recovery has started, as you would expect it to, given that there's no systemic reason for South Africa to operate at these low levels. It was the result of economic activity being squashed by lockdown. Right, so what's been behind this recovery? Which sort of sources of demand have brought about the recovery? Well, it's interesting. You can see here, I give you the breakdown of GDP from the expenditure or the demand side of the economy. And that beige bar there shows you what government did. They leaned against the wind. They kept spending going. They didn't accelerate it simply because they're facing enormous budget constraints, but they leaned against the wind nonetheless. They kept spending stable. They provided direct support to households and to companies. Yes, it did not resemble even remotely the level of generosity we saw in advanced countries. But given that South Africa is not a rich country, we are a developing country, we are an emerging economy, they did as much as they could given their budget constraints. So that clearly helped. And so they played that counter-cyclical role that you would expect government to play during the course of the pandemic. But the big boost, the lift, came from consumer spending, which is essentially that blue bar line there. You can see how consumers bounce back quite quickly, and consumer spending levels have largely returned to pre-pandemic levels. So it's been a lot faster than anyone anticipated. You may have recalled last year there was a tremendous amount of speculation that it will take us 2, 3, 4 years to get back just to the size of the economy that prevailed prior to lockdown. But what we are seeing now is that some elements of the economy is actually returning quite quickly to what prevailed prior to the lockdown. Now, it is important to bear in mind, though, if we're comparing ourselves to the end of 2019, there is a bit of a problem in that South Africa was in recession at the end of 2019. So that in itself is not a measure of success, because the economy at that point was still not an inclusive economy. It was still not resulting in rising living standards for the bulk of South Africans. You still had unemployment creeping up. It, at that point, was touching record highs. Of course, now after COVID, we have exceeded that. Youth unemployment is still systemically and persistently high. And at the same time, poverty levels have been increasing, even in 2019. So it's not a great benchmark. but we have returned to those levels in terms of consumer spending already. So if you then look at, or very close to it, we're slightly down from it, but very close to it nonetheless, 1.3% below the levels that prevailed at the end of 2019. That's where PCE or consumer spending is now. And then the other boost came from exports. Exports bounced back really quickly and provided a lot of momentum in the process. And this, of course, is purely a function of what was happening in the world economy. In the world economy, we saw that the moment the crisis struck, the moment the pandemic landed, governments imposed lockdown, strict lockdown. At one point in April, 85% of the world economy was essentially under lockdown. So you can imagine how dramatic that impact was. Your rich countries, your advanced countries, immediately switched to stimulus gear. And we saw that the US Federal Reserve and all the other major central banks, from the ECB to the Bank of Japan, slashed interest rates to near zero. They didn't stop there, though. They also opened the taps on the money printing machines, in other words, the so-called quantitative easing, and they pumped liquidity into the system. It's also perhaps interesting to note that the quantitative easing programs of this pandemic is very different to what we saw during the global financial crisis. In this pandemic, you've had the central bank literally directly supporting companies and individuals and keeping the credit taps open and keeping credit flowing in order to prevent what is a health crisis from developing into a financial crisis. And it was an enormous success. If it wasn't for that, COVID-19 and the lockdown could have been far more severe than it's turned out to be. Okay, so that's the one thing they did. And the other thing they did is that they started to support governments, accelerated fiscal stimulus, and they started to support their economies. And they did this through furlough schemes, where essentially they paid companies to keep staff on their payroll and to pay them a monthly salary, even though the business is closed and theoretically no income is coming in. They also provided an extended unemployment insurance benefits, and they provided support to companies that was the most severely affected by the lockdown restrictions. And of course, with all of the stimulus in place, the world economy, once they started easing lockdown restrictions, the world economy bounced back very strongly. And that's what you see in our export numbers, is that strong rebound in the global economy. We'll look at that a little bit later on as well. And in the process, what we also saw in this rebound is that commodity prices started to rally. And the rally in commodity prices provided an added support to South Africa because we are, of course, big producers and exporters of commodities. So you look at that green line, that provided a lot of momentum as well, exports bouncing back very strongly. Now, in this recovery, which industries were really behind the rebound? Well, interestingly enough, if you look at the blue bar there, agriculture, of course, is an essential service, so it was the least affected by the lockdown restrictions. That continued to operate, and we had a very good crop in 2020. In fact, we had a record crop, and then we had another good crop this year, and that has sustained the economy and it has helped. But of course, agriculture is a tiny portion of the economy. It only makes up about 3% of GDP. So on its own, it is not that significant. At the end of the day, the lift really came from the rebound in mining, which you can see there, is this line with a dot in it, and that rebounded very quickly. Of course, that is just a mirror image of the rebound in exports, which was driven by the global recovery and the rise in international commodity prices. We also saw a nice recovery in manufacturing production, although not quite as convincing and quite as robust as we experienced in the mining sector. And then finally, your wholesale, retail, motor trade, your domestic trade also made a significant contribution to the recovery. And that really is, again, the mirror image of consumer spending rebounding and providing some support to the economy. Right, so that is where we are. We are in the process of a recovery. That's the good news. We are returning to 2019's levels. Many industries are already there, all right? If we now go further, this is all the GDP numbers, and they end at the first quarter of this year. If we go beyond the first quarter of this year, we have a quick look at what happened in the second quarter, you can see that the momentum continued to come from exactly the same sources. It comes from a very strong performance from mining. Mining now already 105%, 106% of the levels that prevailed in 2019. So mining has largely completely recouped the losses of lockdown and of 2020. Manufacturing has not been that convincing, but it's very close, 97% of 2019's level. So it's largely recouped the losses of 2020. So you can see it's again mining and manufacturing that's providing the momentum to the recovery, and that is helping us move back to the levels that prevailed in 2019. Consumer spending is providing an added boost, and you can see here I have all the elements of domestic trade. I have wholesale, retail, new vehicle sales. I also have restaurants, pubs, and the others, and I have hotels and other accommodations, whether it be B&Bs and so forth. And you can see vehicle sales have done exceptionally well, pretty much back to the levels that prevailed prior to the pandemic and prior to lockdown. Wholesale sales very close to that, 99.7, pretty much 100% of 2019's levels, and retail sales equally very close to that at 99% of last year's level. And this is consumer spending. Consumer spending has proved very resilient, and it has bounced back quite quickly. But again, it's returning to 2019's level. And as I said, that is not a high bar. So certainly the good news is we are starting to leave the damage of the lockdown behind us, the strict lockdown that is, and we are starting to move forward. But you can see it's not an even recovery.
Seems like we've lost Nikki. I can't hear sound on my side. I think there's a sound problem here. I cannot hear a thing. Can anybody hear sound?
Ronnie, it looks like we've actually lost her for a moment.
Okay.
I'm sure she'll rejoin in a second or two.
Okay, let's give it a wait. Thank you. I think, Janet, somebody maybe must contact her and find out what could be the problem. In the meantime, we are following what Nick is talking to us about, the rebound post COVID-19, and the figures are talking for themselves. We just hope that we'll have a back online. But it is good to note that as we're waiting for her to continue this wonderful talk this morning, the recovery that we see in South Africa, although the recovery is actually at a slow pace, but what is pleasing though, when I look at diagrams, is a kind of a a V shape in certain sectors of the economy. Particularly, she mentions about the mining sector. She talks about the manufacturing sector, which is still constrained though, but it's recovering. And of course, the consumer spending, which has given quite a big push towards this recovery. It's not surprising though, colleagues, in my opinion, in that the consumer spending, remember the lockdown was kind of an artificial lockdown. It's not like, we're not like a country coming out of a war zone where our infrastructure is completely flattened and that we must kind of rebuild the economy, rebuild our infrastructure, which under those scenarios, we would expect quite a long time towards recovery. But because we had our infrastructure intact during the lockdown, of course, during that time, we had this supply and demand shock where no production is taking place. On the other side, no demand for the products. And of course, that slowed down. But it's amazing how we could, kind of speed up the process of recovery in the economy due to the increased consumer spending, meaning that money that's been hoarded all the time, money that's been there but not spent because of the lockdown regulations. But with that money, when the economy opened up and the money could get back to the circular flow, we see this dynamic push in the recovery process. But whilst Nikki was talking in my mind, I'm just thinking about to what extent does this growth that we see and we experience in South Africa, to what extent is it able to alleviate poverty? Because we still see poverty increasing. Recently, we've seen the figures of unemployment are quite high. They're shocking and it's very scary. We emphasize growth, which I really very much appreciate, because we cannot be able to create the sufficient jobs that we want. We're talking about 6% GDP growth in order to create jobs. But the opposite of that, we find that the numbers in terms of unemployment are rising, meaning that the growth is not translating to job creation. So I think what kind of strategies, that one can actually adopt in South Africa to make sure that such growth translates to job creation. We had 2.5% of unemployment in South Africa that's been released, meaning that we have to ensure that our economy has got to restructure it, because we inherited a structure of the economy that is based on inequality, and not much has been done to fight inequality. We have a challenge of inequality, poverty, unemployment in South Africa, and nothing much has really impacted that structure to ensure that there's equitable distribution of growth across the sectors of the economy. And to me, that is what it's actually going to keep us back, because you have people that are pushed deeper and deeper into poverty, and without any kind of help to get them out, And also, what we see is that the government tax revenue is also under severe threat because of unemployment. Because more people that are unemployed, your personal income tax is reduced because the people are not working, so therefore there's no one to tax. And then at the same time, you find the companies that are not able to come back because of COVID-19. And that also adds to the problem, because what we see is that the closing down of the companies, not coming back to full swing in the economy, you find that tax again is going to be reduced. And then that at the end of the day will affect the service delivery. So there's quite a lot that South Africa has to do in order to ensure that we respond to these challenges. We cannot downplay the impact of COVID-19, the severe impact in the economy of South Africa. I see Nikki is going to join us just now. I'm very happy to see her back. She'll continue this wonderful talk. And please, colleagues, you are welcome to I'm watching the chat box, to put your questions in the chat box so that when Nikki is ready, she can respond to those questions. Nikki, are you back?
She's connecting soon. I'm just on the phone with her now, Prof.
Okay.
Just give me another minute with her quickly.
All right. All right. We'll just wait for her. Okay, it's connected. There we go. Welcome back, Nikki. I think she's muted. Nikki, you're muted. Just unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so a bad situation we've got here. I got lost. I got lost in the computer and somehow, even though I didn't lose my internet connection. So hopefully, let's go back more or less. I'm not sure where I ended, Professor. Maybe you can give me a sense before I got lost or got dropped.
I think, yes, you were just talking about the industries that, rebounding back, talking about the consumer spending, and you was talking about also the manufacturing sector that is also recovering, but still constrained. You were around, and of course, the mining sector as well, they say that it's got a very, strong growth and recouped, of course, the losses pre-COVID-19. So you were around, that area of things.
Okay. All right. So where I am now, more or less, or there?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the consumer spending.
Okay, perfect. So then we know where we were, so we can continue. So yeah. Consumer spending did rebound, and I don't know if I made the point, but I'll make it again. We've had a very uneven recovery, so that has not been a good thing, and it's been uneven among sectors. It's been uneven among income groups, and just to recoup, obviously, we are comparing ourselves with a fairly low bar. So even though we're starting to put the worst of the strict lockdown or the complete economic shutdown behind us, we are still really at a very weak level because we were stuck in an economy that was slowly deteriorating, moving and stagnating before this pandemic struck us, before lockdown was imposed. So the question here is, how do we lift growth on a more longer term basis? Now, there's certain things that we do have to address in the short term, things we have to look at right now, and we need to pay attention to right now. So I'm first going to take you through that, and then I'm going to focus our attentions on some of the more longer term issues or medium to longer term issues that South Africa need to pay attention to, and that could make a significant difference at the end of the day if we get it right. So obviously in the very short term, the thing we need to focus on is putting this pandemic behind us. Now we are in the midst of a third wave. This third wave has already proved to be worse than the second wave. It's proved to be worse than the first wave, obviously. And it's also mutating, it's changing. So it's a very sneaky and nasty little virus, this. And essentially, what we're looking at is that we now have the Delta variant that is becoming the dominant strain, not just here in South Africa, but also in new cases in Europe and in many other parts of the world. And we know about this variant that it's not necessarily more deadly, but it is undoubtedly more transmissible. In other words, it spreads a lot quicker. And that's what we're dealing with right now. We've moved to an adjusted level 4 lockdown. I think it's important to bear in mind that the approach government has taken in the second wave and in the third wave, they really do need to be given some credit for that. There's a huge amount of criticism towards government. But these targeted measures, even though it does still affect some industries very badly, and in fact, it makes their situation quite desperate. The reality is that these targeted measures are a lot better than a blanket lockdown, all right? So focusing on intervening where human beings interact and where there is greater contact between human beings, because that's what the virus needs to spread. It needs contact between human beings. That is the better route to go than just shutting down the entire economy. So I think it is a more intelligent approach. And yes, it is perhaps not as dampening as shutting down everything, but we have to balance this. We can't completely slaughter our economy just because of the pandemic. The only, but I think where there's valid criticism against government is that they really should. If you are requiring alcohol producers to shut down, if you're banning the sale of their product, all the way from the production to the processing, to the retailing side of it, then you really do need to provide some kind of compensation. Even if you have to borrow money to make that possible. So that, I think, is a valid criticism. The second valid criticism is that the pandemic isn't new, all right? We've been in this for over a year now. And we went into level 5 lockdown, which ruined the economy because government said they needed time to prepare the healthcare system to deal with this crisis. That was their precise argument, right? And now we understand that that doesn't exist. They didn't do it, all right? So that is fair criticism. Why are we unprepared? Why can our hospitals not cope? We've had over a year to get prepared. But in terms of the regulations, in terms of the restrictions, it's the best we can do. There are no good choices when it comes to lockdown. You're going to hurt someone, but you really should follow that up with some compensation. And you really should, by now, have been prepared to deal with this lockdown. Okay, so that's the other side of it. The other thing we need to do is we need to absolutely start vaccinating. And in fact, if you use your entire budget to get vaccines this year, you do that. The economic strategy for 2021 is vaccinate, 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 vaccinate. Now, we were slow out of the blocks. We had a very strange way of approaching it. Government tried to control the process. I do understand to some extent why they did that, because they didn't have enough vaccines and they wanted to make sure that the vulnerable received the first batches of vaccines. But now, once the vaccines are starting to flow, once they start to come in, really the sooner you open this thing up and you allow Dis-Chem and Clicks in every single hospital to get vaccines and to distribute that, the better. And the sooner you're going to get mileage. That's exactly what President Biden did in the United States. He said, let go of the preciousness of the state, make vaccines available everywhere, at the bus stop, at the local cafe. It doesn't matter, make it available absolutely everywhere. And that is what they did. Bring the army in, bring your nurses in, distribute them, and just get these shots into the arms of your citizens. And that made an enormous difference to the US. And it's one of the reasons they have really undergone a remarkable recovery from the setback of COVID. So I think South Africa needs to adopt a very similar attitude. Government clearly doesn't have the capacity. The private sector does have the capacity. So don't be stupid about that. Use that capacity. So that's one thing that I think is very important. You can see South Africa's vaccination rates really not great at all. Africa as a whole at the bottom, but South Africa don't have that much in common with Africa. We have quite a lot in common with Chile. We are both middle income emerging economies or developing economies. Look at what Chile has done. There's a whole bunch of emerging and developing economies far ahead of us. Brazil, where they've been criticized heavily for the slow rollout, is still miles ahead of us. Mexico, miles ahead of us. Russia, miles ahead of us. And these countries are very similar to South Africa. So if they can do it, then we certainly can do it as well. So that's the first objective in the short term. Get rid of this virus. We can't afford it. We don't have an economy that can survive with repeated lockdowns. We're going to do irreparable damage. So prioritize and get rid of the virus. That's the first short-term priority. Then within this particular cycle, we really need to exploit the opportunities that are available to us. So in other words, exploit the global cycle. From a business perspective, exploit the global cycle. So let me tell you what that cycle is looking like. The world economy is bouncing back. That bounce back has been a lot faster and a lot stronger than anyone anticipated. The IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, all your private economists working for major international banks all over the world. It's been faster, it's been more robust than anybody expected. China did its bit. It contained the virus quickly. It stimulated its economy aggressively. It got it growing. I know there's a huge amount of irony there because obviously China brought the virus to the world as well. But the recovery globally is underway, and it's faster and it's stronger and it's more robust than everybody thought it would be. Granted, very few economies are actually back to the levels that prevailed prior to the imposition of lockdown, but nonetheless, it's been a robust resurgence. And in fact, most of your economists and your forecasters out there are now expecting this recovery to continue and to remain robust this year and even next year. And the anticipation now is that the US, many advanced countries, will pretty much return to 2019 levels within the first half of this year. Some of them might even move over 2019's levels in the second half of this year, and then they will be back into clear growth territory. And the anticipation is that we're looking at a fairly robust response and rebound in the world economy. The IMF expects growth this year of 6%. Don't make too much of that. It's coming off a low base, but they expect global growth of 6%. Then they expect, more importantly, global growth of 4.4%. By now, we've recouped the losses of 2020, and the world economy is back into positive territory. And within that context, growth of 4.4% is quite strong. And thereafter, they expect the world economy to slowly revert back to trend, maintaining growth of around 3.5%, which in world terms is quite strong. So we're looking at a fairly robust global recovery. Now, this didn't happen by accident. I've already mentioned global monetary policy, the US Federal Reserve, other advanced countries pumped a huge amount of stimulus into the system in order to make sure that the world economy recovers. They didn't stop there. We saw very, very aggressive fiscal stimulus being put out during the course of last year. In your advanced countries, in North America, for example, the level of fiscal stimulus have been enormous, unprecedented, more than 7.5% of their GDP. A similar situation in Europe, where it's between 5 to 10% of GDP. It's really, really been dramatic. And then in the case of the United States, the fiscal stimulus after President Biden passed his 1.9 trillion stimulus earlier this year, where essentially they just sent checks to households and said, there you go, go spend it, repay your debt, fix your mortgage, service your landlord, do with it whatever you want to, we're not judging, off you go. And after they did that, of course, we have seen a dramatic acceleration in US consumer spending, also in US savings and in US investment, in the equity market particularly. So the bottom line is, in the US, the stimulus is now way above 10% of GDP. And really, honestly, the US stimulus also contains a long-term element. So we've had the 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. The aim of that was just to get some momentum in the system. And it's certainly done that. But President Biden doesn't want to stop there. They also want to get past a $2 trillion American Jobs Plan and a 1.8 trillion Americans Families Plan. Now, the one that has the most significance for South Africa is the American Jobs Plan. It focuses really on renewing the US's infrastructure, on rebuilding their infrastructure, and also on transitioning the US economy to clean energy in order to counter climate change. You may have seen in the news that climate change is becoming increasingly real. The Americans got a nasty reminder of that from this latest heat dome. The impact on that in China and Canada of this heat dome has been that over 100 people have lost their lives and some towns have completely burned down. So climate change is a reality. It's something the world has to prepare for, and it's something the world has to take seriously. The reality, though, with climate change is that it is a very dynamic thing. What we do today will only impact the climate in 10, 15, 20 years' time. So the longer we delay the adjustment to clean energy, the more disastrous we will make climate change in 20, 30 years' time. So it's something that requires a bit of foresight, and it requires at the same time a tremendous amount of urgency. And it seems to me that there is renewed momentum in the world economy to deal with climate change. And President Biden's plan to a large extent focuses on that. But don't forget that there is a very human element here as well. The US has suddenly woken up and they've realized that in certain things they are actually behind China. For example, in the transition to clean energy. In fact, I can tell you that China dominates the processing of many of the minerals that will be needed to transition to clean energy. They dominate it. They also have tremendous power over the entire supply chain. And that's part of the reason why China came to Africa, to make sure they can get cobalt for batteries, to make sure that they can get lithium for batteries, to make sure that they have sufficient access to copper. And the US has suddenly realized we need these things, and we don't have a footprint in the places where you find these minerals. And we don't have the processing capacity to deal with these minerals. That is all dominated by China. And so this intense competition with China is also strategic. It's about the US wanting to get the upper hand over the Chinese over the longer term, all right? So the bottom line is there's an opportunity, though, for Africa. There's an opportunity for South Africa in the Americans' jobs plans, because there's a big climate element in both the EU's investment plan and the Americans' job plan. Of the 2.3 trillion US dollars President Biden ultimately wished to get passed through, 1 trillion will go to climate change and the transition to clean energy and clean transport systems, electric vehicles, public transport systems that don't run all fossil fuels and do not add emissions to the atmosphere. And similarly with the Eurozone's stimulus plan, their recovery plan, 30% is devoted to the adjustment or the transition to clean energy. So what does this mean for South Africa? Now, I said before, we are producers and exporters of commodities. And what it means is that there's going to be much stronger demand for commodities. The shift in fiscal policy, a strategic shift in fiscal policy in advanced countries away from boosting consumption expenditure of households and companies towards infrastructure development, infrastructure expansion, and also this, very critically, this transition to green energy is very important because it will create stronger demand for commodities. Something people are not aware of is that green energy technology, whether it be electric vehicles, an electric vehicle use 30% more minerals than a fossil fuel or driven vehicle or your conventional vehicles. Your green energy sources also use far more minerals and a far greater variety of minerals than your standard and conventional forms of energy. And as a result, there's going to be demand for a greater combination of minerals. These are the minerals that are likely to be in demand. So the infrastructure drive will continue to support demand for iron ore, manganese, ferromanganese, chromium. By the way, South Africa sits with a dominant share of world deposits of manganese and ferromanganese. We also have the greatest amount of chromium. Iron and steel, aluminium, all of those will be in great demand. Climate change uses a lot of copper, which puts the DRC back on the map. It uses lithium, it uses cobalt, graphite, manganese, again, nickel, zinc, rare earth minerals, aluminium, and your platinum group minerals. And as you know, South Africa has the largest deposits in the world, or reserves, if you like, in the world of platinum and your platinum group metals, from palladium all the way through to rhodium. So here's an opportunity for us, and we really should gear up to exploit it. The other thing that will help us is that, of course, demand for commodities, right now it's already rallied dramatically. In the commodity markets, they are starting to price in the rebound in the world economy. They're also starting to price in the likely impact of this infrastructure drive being undertaken by the US, the EU, and other advanced countries on the demand for commodities. Now, I think at the moment the markets have overshot. That happens from time to time. We should start to see a bit of a correction, but I do think that there is a story to be made here for higher and elevated commodity prices over the next 3 to 5 years, which presents South Africa with a unique and special opportunity. All right, so there are these things that we can do that could already make a big difference to our economy. Then we need to deal with some of the longer term issues, right? We need to deal with some of the long-term constraints on the South African economy. And how do we lift growth to a more sustainable and a stronger path, a higher plane, if you like, over the medium to longer term? I think the first thing we need to do is we need to remind ourselves where growth comes from, how economies grow. At the end of the day, it's not rocket science. It's really very simple. Economies grow by using labor, capital, and we talk about capital here, we don't talk about money. We talk about machinery, we talk about equipment, we talk about plant, we talk about factories, buildings, and how all of that is combined with labor to produce goods and services. At the same time, you also talk about technology, ideas, innovations. That's your third strain. All of that is put together and hopefully in a productive manner. And the more productively it is combined, the more efficiently it is combined, the faster the growth that it produces. And also, the more likely it is that the citizens of a country will enjoy a sustained period of rising living standards. So it's these three factors that drive growth over the long term. And why do we grow? We grow really because we want to lift the living standards of our population. Okay? That's really what it's about. Economic growth for the sake of economic growth is meaningless. What this is all about is about lifting the living standards of the population. Now, in South Africa, of course, there are issues with all three of these inputs. There are big issues with labor. A lot of it has to do with apartheid and with the inequality of not just education, but access to education and access to lifelong learning. And ultimately, that legacy has not been resolved in the post-apartheid era. We haven't paid attention to education in the way we did. We've had over 2 decades to make sure that regardless of your income, if you send your child to the local school, they have as good a chance to succeed in life as somebody that is very rich at the end of the day. And yet this has not happened in the case of South Africa. All right, so we haven't dealt with those challenges and we need to start dealing with them in a very serious way. Then there's training, there is secondary education, higher education. We now have enormous technology at our disposal. We may not have been the inventors of that, but we should really put it to use in a smart way. And we can accelerate training and education through the use of technology. Then when we talk about capital, which is what I'm going to focus on in a second's time, that's very important as well. And finally, when we get to technology, obviously South Africa is a laggard as far as that's concerned, but there's more to that part of it. There's ideas, there's innovation, there's entrepreneurship. And it's how all of that combines at the end of the day. Is it efficient? Is it not efficient? Okay. So what's happened in South Africa is government has chosen to intervene along this entire line, right? This entire line is where they've decided to intervene. And the problem with that is that intervention has been highly inefficient. And what it's done is, in fact, it's made South Africa less productive rather than more productive. So that also needs to be rethought. But what I'm going to focus on is just one side of the equation. And for reasons I can't understand, my computer is frozen now. So let me see what I can do. So basically, I'm going to focus on fixed investment, right? So when we talk about fixed investment, That is capital. That's the capital section of this recovery. And the problem with fixed investment, of course, is that it took an enormous hit during the COVID crisis. It fell to very, very low levels, and it hasn't really shown any sign of recovery. And this is the most frightening bit we are seeing at the moment. So what's been behind that collapse in fixed investment? And why does fixed investment matter? What is fixed investment? It really is when companies go out there, they have the confidence to go borrow the money or raise it directly in the market, and they expand their operations. And only when you expand your operations will you employ more people. So fixed investment activity is essentially the essence to getting some employment creation going in this economy. And the fact that we're sitting with record levels of unemployment relates directly to the fact that we've had this implosion in fixed investment activity. Okay, so what's been behind that? Now, there are three agents that undertake capital expenditure in this economy. There's state-owned enterprises, there's government, and there's the private sector. The biggest portion and the biggest slice of all capital expenditure in South Africa is made up of the private sector. But what's happened here is that fixed investment's been weak across the board, but it's been disastrously weak among state-owned enterprises. Look at that red line and how capital expenditure by state-owned enterprises have imploded. Now, why does that matter? Because in South Africa, we've decided that state-owned enterprises will provide all economic infrastructure, right? So they have an enormous impact on the entire economy. They have an enormous impact on the private sector. They provide electricity, road, rail, port transportation. So they impact the cost structure of private companies in a very significant way. They impact the efficiency and a private firm's ability to service its clients, to export its goods in a very significant way. And what we have now is that our infrastructure is essentially decaying because of the implosion in capital expenditure by state-owned enterprises. Our infrastructure has not been maintained, it's not been expanded, and it's become unreliable, and it's become hugely expensive. And it's driving up hurdle rates and the cost of production and adding to the hurdle rate that a private firm needs to pass to get capital expenditure off the ground. So it's really constraining private companies' ability to expand their operations. The most obvious of these are obviously the electricity constraint. We're still dealing with that problem. We still have an electricity constraint. So sadly, that's the situation we find ourselves in. And you can see this graph tells you an incredible story. Bear in mind that over the past decade, South Africa has built 2 new coal-fired power plants, Medupi and Kusile. We now know that that system was so corrupt, so inefficient, that those 2 power plants are essentially faulty, flawed, structurally flawed. It's estimated that we'll be lucky if we can operate Medupi at about 60% of its supposed installed capacity. And we'd be lucky if we can get Kusile to 40% of its supposed installed capacity. So an absolute disaster, an example of a failure. And as a result of that, even though we've built these new power stations, we today produce less electricity than we did before we undertook the capital expenditure. So that's clearly not the way to do it. And Eskom is at fault here. What has saved us is this green bar. It's renewable energy. And with the world shifting towards making climate change a priority, to making clean energy and clean transport systems a priority, South Africa really should be joining that party, all right? Now, in this regard, we need to solve this crisis. We're not going to grow until that happens. We're not going to create jobs. Cost-effective and reliable energy and electricity is not a luxury. It's essential to stronger growth, to any kind of growth, and to fixed investment, and therefore to job creation. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to be resolved in the next 5 years. Eskom's not going to be fixed in the next 5 years. That means we have to get creative. We've got to allow more private sources of electricity generation. Now, one encouraging development we've had lately is that government has made a concession and they will allow 100 megawatts of embedded generation. Now, that's all very good because companies will exploit that opportunity. But we also know, and we hear from sources, that they're considering attaching local content requirements to that. Now, here again is the problem with South Africa's economic policies, is that we constantly put multiple objectives to policies. The embedded generation allowance is to deal with a crisis. You can't attach a local, a long-term requirement to that. So what if we don't have local production capacity in renewable energy, all right? And we don't have sufficient. What happens then? Well, you just make it very difficult for companies to find a way to exploit that concession of 100 megawatts of embedded generation. And you find it a very difficult way, make it very difficult for them to get their way around the electricity constraint. And in other words, you stop the growth in the economy. So policy needs to be simple. The objective needs to be clear. And you need to stop trying to meet multiple outcomes through one set of policies. It's the collective that matters. So our policy really is very complex. It's very onerous. There's a lot of red tape to it. And very often, policies coming from different parts of government actually work against each other. They're counterproductive, and the outcome is no one's better off. All right, so we also need to fix this. We need to deal with corruption. We need to deal with these poor policy choices. We need to deal with the excessive legislation. We need to deal with the fact that we actually just can't implement anything. And we need to deal with a limited state capacity because it is producing poor outcomes. So my message today is, how do we move to a higher growth plane? We need to solve the electricity crisis. We need to get creative in the way we solve it. And it is absolutely essential that government gets its act together, especially on the policy front, and realize that its policy needs to be simpler, it needs to be clearer. They need to understand the unintended consequences of policy choices, and they need to make sure that all their policy moves in the right direction and in the same direction to begin with, so that it doesn't wind up neutralizing each other and at the end of the day, leaving the economy in a state of paralysis. And that's my final comment. I hope we've done all right with time. I apologize for the gremlins in the IT systems. I have no idea why I got dropped, because my internet was still functioning absolutely normally. But in any case, I hope there's time for questions. I will leave you with our sheet for forecasts. You can certainly all get a copy of this presentation, and if you have any questions, you can direct it towards us. So back to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, for this wonderful, for this wonderful presentation today, Nikki. This great talk this morning, which gave us the whole plan. In fact, and I sat and listened to you, and as you were presenting the opportunities that is at our disposal, I mean, the demand for the commodity products and so forth, that can be found in South Africa. You refer to a number of things, that we should take advantage of, to help this economy. You also at the same time pose us with a plan, to go forward as to what we should do. You've left us the solutions, So I don't waste time. There is one question that I just want to read out from the chat box. And apologies for the time, nonetheless, was matters beyond our control, which we also quickly recovered from that, and they could come back and continue with their talk. We're supposed to close at 11 o'clock. We just wanted to, we got about a minute or so, but just want to take about 2-3 minutes to address these questions. There's one question that is in the chat box, Nikki, that I'm just going to read it. It's from Theo Pesedenot. Welcome, Theo. It says, what is the general impact on economic development in SA? Is there a lack of developmental mindset from an organized labor perspective? Are the unions using the available funds with SETAs to increase the capacity of their members in order to focus on, for example, productivity? That's
very good question. So thank you for that. So like I said, productivity is everything. Countries don't get rich. Living standards don't improve and the issue focus with productivity. And in fact, in South Africa, we never mention it. We rarely ever mention it. We don't even keep proper statistics on productivity. So it is something we need to start paying a lot of attention to. And I think there are two sides to this. Labor and organized labor, I think, certainly have played a big role in the deterioration in South Africa's economic performance. If you think about how their role changed over the years, they were absolutely instrumental in promoting social justice during the apartheid years. They played a very, very valuable role there. They were also very, very instrumental as part of a social compact that we saw form in the new South Africa, in the post-apartheid South Africa. And in the 1990s, they played a very significant role. Government, they abided by the laws. Certainly the actions of labor unions became a lot more predictable. But during the time of President Zuma's reign, what we saw was that unions became far more politicized, and as a result, also far more destructive, and with very little consequence. And at the same time, there is no mention of productivity. And yes, I think that is important. I think unions and business need to have an equal focus on promoting productivity, and an element of that is training. Now, businesses also have a responsibility here. It's not just unions. Businesses also have a responsibility. We have to make it possible for our staff to actually upskill, right? So it's all fine and well say, okay, we've got all these courses, use them, but there's only 24 hours in a day. Okay, so when is it going to happen? If you load people with a huge amount of work, if they have to stand on a production line the entire day, when are they supposed to train? When are they supposed to upskill? All right. And in fact, it should be part of a manager's performance appraisal, giving your staff enough time to be upskilled and to learn new skills and to integrate those skills. And I think that's another thing. We've got a lot of training happening. I see it even at Nedbank, but we don't take the time out. We don't take a breather. Because speed is not necessarily productivity, right? Let's not confuse these two. They're not the same thing. We also need to take time to make sure the new stuff that we are learning, the new technology we are bringing into the system, is it efficient? Does it combine well with our labor inputs? Are the outputs synchronized? Are they productive? Are they smooth? We don't take the time. Is it all integrated? All right. And I often see that we don't take the time with that. We throw a whole bunch of knowledge on people, but we don't actually integrate that and change the way we work. And that's the idea of education. It needs to change the way you work. Right, so that's another thing that
I think we freeze again here with Nikki. It's unfortunate. There were 3 more questions that you'd like to pose to her. But there's one question that says, are we going to get the presentation? That's from Ms. Pumeza Kate. We will certainly have the copies. I think Nikki mentioned that the copies of the presentation will be made available.
I'll send it through, no problem.
Nikki, I'm just going to give you 3 more questions. Yeah, I'm just going to give you 3 more questions. Just together, and that's the last lot. Then we can then wrap up. The 3 more questions. Maybe Nikki can just write them down. There's one from Tokolo Diamonds, which reads as follows: how will our loan agreements with IMF potentially affect our economic transactions as SOEs with foreign participants? That's the first one. The second one is from Percy Tlangoti. Thanks, Nikki. Is the so-called circular economy a realistic part of the solution? Right? Got that, Nikki? And the third and the last one is, does the minimum wage legislation in SA impact our economic potential for accelerated growth, productivity, and improvement on standard of living of the whole rather than a few? Those are the last 3 questions. Nikki, you can just take all 3 of them together Then we
Okay,
go.
so on the IMF loans, no, it's not going to really impact us at all. The IMF stands separate of any kind of further developments you might be, or initiatives you might be taking to deal with SOE reforms. So for example, if you want to get a foreign equity partner, that's got no bearing on the IMF loan. The IMF loan was done under the emergency facility. It comes with absolutely no significant strings attached. So it is not a standard IMF loan in any ways where there are conditionality attached to those. We got them really under the emergency set of rules. And government is actually doing, National Treasury is not doing badly as far as that's concerned. You know, they've already twice this year cut the amount of bonds they are auctioning into the market. So we know they've raised more money than they initially needed. We know as a result of that, that cash sits in their current account and that they've taken that cash and they're going to use it to repay debt. So we're doing okay on that front, and the IMF loan won't present us with any problems as far as that's concerned. This is not a standard IMF loan. That's very important to remember. If you go and you take you know, the sort of normal finance, then it does come with a structural adjustment program, and it does come with conditionality. We didn't take that type of funding. So it's got no impact on SOEs. Is the circular economy a realistic solution? Not entirely, okay? But it is something that could flourish, could have a very big part to play. And I think that's the essence here. It could have a very big part to play. There are very clever ways of organizing your economy. And the outcome of those sort of circular and sustainable systems really will enhance the living standards of more South Africans. So I certainly think that it's something we should pay attention to, and something we should make an integrated part of our economic policies and of the way we function and the way we operate. And then finally, on the minimum wage is a bit of a problem, because it is obviously something that is imposed regardless of the conditions that prevail in certain industries. All right. It also means that those that are willing to work for less than the minimum wage will not be able to do so. And so we do know that the imposition of the minimum wage has contributed to job losses in certain industries, particularly agriculture. All right. Not everywhere, but certainly in agriculture. It could also potentially impact on your hospitality, leisure, tourism, those industries. At this point, it's a moot issue, because obviously they're finding themselves in deep recession. So employment is the last thing on their minds. Survival is what matters to them at this point. But I think generally speaking, the key here is we do need to have some minimal level. We do need to have some minimum bar, but the actual level matters, right? And it's very difficult to determine what that level is. You can't set it too high, because then it discourages employment creation. You set it too low, then it's meaningless and it doesn't really improve anybody's living standards. And the problem with economics is there's no perfect way of determining what that level is. And we'll only know 5, 6, 7, 10 years down the line whether we set it too high or whether we set it too low. But an easier way of looking at this is we need to focus on productivity. If we improve labor productivity, then we make labor an asset. Mm. If labor is an asset to companies and to investors, then wages is a non-issue. Wages in Europe are higher for similar work jobs than we have in South Africa, are a lot higher. How do they sustain that? They're more productive than we are. That's the bottom line. Okay, so that's where I'll end it.
Brilliant. Productivity, that's the key. That's the key. We're just about to wrap up there. Thanks, Nikki, for those responses to those questions. We're just about to wrap up the session now. We do apologize for that, the time that we lost in the technical glitches that were beyond our control. I note, Nikki, that okay, there's one, I think it's a comment, we need to focus on productivity in SA. That's from Alice Okochian. Thanks for that comment. And then there's two more that pop in here. Are you concerned about centralized top-down versus decentralized bottom-up approach from Damons? Tolokotokoro Damons says, will quantum financing change the structure of our economy? Are we privy to these changes in SA? I think these are important questions. Let's tackle these two, Nikki, then we wrap up.
Okay, so in terms of centralized versus non-centralized, yeah, I think, a decentralized system have benefits. And also remember, as climate change become a greater issue, and as we start to consider the circular economy, consider the sustainable economy, that is by its nature more inclusive. It is by its nature more decentralized. So that's why I'm saying that we can't ignore it. We need to investigate those opportunities, and we need to integrate it into the way we think, integrate it into the way we develop this economy going forward. So decentralized systems are very important. The one point where I do believe that you have to have some focus in the middle or at the top, if you like, is when it comes to leadership. At some point, someone has to make a decision. And we've seen the damage of a lack of leadership in South Africa over the past 12 years. And sometimes, there are situations in which consensus seeking is important, but there's situations where you ultimately have to make a decision and you have to move forward. So leadership is important, and some degree of central power is important. So it's about the balance between those two. And then finally, in terms, I think, I can't see the questions now, they're moving up, but I think the one was quantum financing. No, I don't think we're quite there yet. It's definitely something we need to pay attention to. I don't think the country is ready for it. I don't think that banks have entirely assimilated those sorts of developments yet, South African banks anyway. But it's a valid point. It's something that requires some digging and some further research.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, everyone. Let me take the opportunity to thank our attendees, our audience, this wonderful audience. We wouldn't have been able to really have this successful webinar without your attendance. Thank you for the questions as well. Unfortunately, we can't take all of them at this point in time. I want to take an opportunity to thank every one of you that has attended. Thank you, Nikki, for your presentation, and also the people that attended the session. I think it's been a robust session with all the ideas that's been thrown out here, which we going to chew on continuously from now going forward. And now I just want to appreciate you all for attending, and we look forward as well to hosting you at our annual leadership summit on 27th and 8th of July. So we have now come to the close of the webinar for this morning. Thanks, everyone. May you all have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon going forward. Thank you.